All right, so it is news. We will go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Elena Whitaker. I am the Water and Conservation Educator with Iowa Learning Farms. Thank you for joining us today for the Iowa Learning Farms webinar conservation series. And then today's topic and presenter is Manure, an ancient fertilizer in a digital age, with Dr. Daniel Andersen, who is an associate professor and extension specialist here at Iowa State in the ABE department. I will let you take it away.
All right, thank you. So I like coming up with fancy titles for talking about crap, right? And I think it's a subject that really is important. I think I grew up on a small dairy farm in central Wisconsin, and it was important to me then, and it remains important to all of us now as we think about what's it mean for Iowa agriculture, what's it mean for our society moving forward, and how do we think about manure and use it a little better to help protect water quality. So I do have a presentation. I'm going to go through it. But I really look forward to hopefully generating some conversation and discussion. So if you have thoughts, questions at any time, get them in the chat, and we'll definitely try and tailor some of the presentation and talk to that. Basically the same slide, but if you are interested in hearing musings about poop ever, I do keep a blog where I dive into a little bit more detail about why I have some of the ideas I do, and ramble with some manure jokes there as well. And you can find me on Twitter. So a few things that we're going to try and cover today. I'm going to talk briefly about water quality. I think we all know that manure can have some water quality impacts, so I'm not going to belabor that. But I really want to talk about selecting manure application rates, a challenge that's specific to manure, and I think that's some timing issues. We'll talk a little bit about yield goal and how it compares to MRTN, and sort of why we see what we see and what water quality implications that we have from that. And then I'll try and talk about maybe some common issues and some opportunities for change in the future as we move ahead. So when I think about water quality contaminants in manure, some of them are unique, right? It's a manure specific challenge, and some of them are more cropping systems fertilizer sort of ideas. And the first three there that I have highlighted are ones that I think about a lot, nitrate, ammonia, and phosphorus. And the truth is, when we look at manure, whether that be solid manure, whether it be liquid manure in a storage, it really doesn't have any nitrate in it at all. It's all either that ammonium form or organic nitrogen. But when we put it out into our field, when we try and utilize it as a fertilizer, we might lose some of it as ammonia to the air, maybe a little bit as ammonia moving with some water. But a lot of that nitrogen, especially with some of our management practices where some manure can get applied a little early in the fall, we have a chance to make nitrate, and we're going to lose some of that nitrate down to our tile drains. Now, that's not a situation that's unique to manure, but I do think manure presents some maybe higher application rates. And I think we'll talk a little bit about why, but I think that might be partially in part to a timing challenge. And then two other ones that I have listed there are relatively unique from manure. When I think about pathogens, we know that's not coming with anhydrous ammonia. We know it's not coming with our MAP or DAP fertilizers. It really is coming from either manure or from a wastewater treatment side. And while I'm not going to dive too deeply into it today, I do think that as we move forward, it is something that we're going to have to pay attention to with manure. I know I have a few projects right now where we're looking at antibiotic resistance, we're looking at pathogens in manure, and how do our current production practices impact their survival, but also what are things we could potentially implement to try and reduce the risk of some of those potential problems moving to water sources in Iowa. And then the last one is organic matter, right? And organic matter is a blessing and a curse. We talk about it a lot these days in a good way. It can help build soil health. When we utilize manure as our fertilizer source, we're putting carbon onto the soil. Roughly 12% of that carbon that's in the manure becomes stable soil organic matter. So it really can build up some of our soil health and be beneficial to us. But it can also be a challenge. If we have a manure spill and it gets into a stream, it will kill fish, right? It sucks the oxygen out of the stream, and we have some challenges. So it's something that many of these, right, are the same. It's a double-edged sword. There's potential positives that can come from utilizing manure, but there's risks and challenges associated with it. One of the questions that I get asked quite frequently, is there too much manure in Iowa? And I think there's lots of ways to think about this, and I would challenge you to maybe broaden some of our definitions. And the one I think about the most, and I think you probably do too, is just there enough land in Iowa to utilize all the manure resources we have? I'm going to show you a map in a slide that's a little bit updated from the ones there on that publication. But if you're interested in reading more, you can check out that publication. But the agronomic approach isn't the only way to think about it, right? You could say that we have water quality challenges challenges, and some of that's related to manure, some of it's related to cropping systems, but it is something that as we move forward, we really have to think about. Another one that really comes to my head is if we can't get manure applied in that application season that we deem appropriate, maybe that means we have too much manure for the infrastructure available. And I think you're maybe going to see me highlight that throughout my talk is we certainly have enough cropland to utilize all of the manure. Roughly, if we were using manure as a resource, it should be able to cover around 1/3 of Iowa cropland in any given year. I think based on the manure management plans, the way we write them and how we actually utilize manure, we're much closer to 25% of our land receiving manure in any given year. Um, Certainly when I say that, I mean, if we're only getting a quarter of all our nutrient needs from manure, whether that be nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, there is space. There are fields that are appropriate to receive that manure in this state. But that doesn't mean they're uniformly distributed throughout the state or uniformly distributed where we need them most around some of our larger livestock producing counties. And I think that's one of the advantages of sort of zooming in and thinking about this at a county level. With that said, all nutrient management decisions are really made at the farm level. So it'd be nice to take a step further. But I think understanding it at a county or a regional level sort of gives us some idea what's happening. To give you an idea what I'm showing in this graph, I have it color coded in 10% increments. So that really dark green there means that 0 to 10% of the potential nitrogen in this case that we need to support crop production can come from manure. Now, a few caveats with that. That's not how much nitrogen I actually need for the crop. That's how much nitrogen is really being removed with the crop, only accounting for corn and non-leguminous crops, right? So I'm not including soybean on this. I am including grass hays, but in Iowa, the majority of that nitrogen use is for corn production. So when you see some of those red counties where it says I can get 90 to 100% of the nitrogen I need from corn, that's actually 90 to 100% of the nitrogen being removed with the corn grain. It is a leaky system. We do have to apply more nitrogen than what will be removed directly in the corn grain. So this is a very conservative estimate. And it doesn't always account for other things that are utilizing nitrogen. For instance, I assume soybeans need zero nitrogen at all. If there's nitrogen present in the soil, they will preferentially use the nitrogen available there before they try and fix their own nitrogen. But I think, while it's easy for me to say 25% of Iowa cropland receives manure, there are counties where a fair amount of our nutrients come from manure, and those tend to be our livestock-rich counties, obviously. And I think that is important as we think about what that might mean for policy implications going forward. Where should we be building new facilities? Where can we build new facilities? And where might manure see some challenges in being utilized as a crop fertilizer and have some incentive to be either over-applied or not fully utilized to the extent of value that it can offer? I just briefly wanted to touch on this. We're going to focus mostly on land application. Where the manure hits the ground is really, I think, the interesting part of this cycle oftentimes, but there's a lot of science behind some of those other aspects. And as we see new innovations and new potentials, I think, especially with things like carbon markets, we might see more focus on how are we storing manure? How are we keeping those greenhouse gas emissions from happening? Alternatively, we might also see some interest with the high fertilizer prices, and how can we do a better job of holding on to ammonia during the manure storage process? And certainly in Iowa, we saw that progression once with pigs moving from that open lot facility more towards lagoons and then eventually deep pits. And while that was happening, we saw less water being added to our manure, and we also saw less ammonia volatilization. When you think about open lot production, generally about half of the nitrogen that animal excretes is volatilized in the air before we have an opportunity to collect it and utilize it as a fertilizer. When we move more towards that deep pit housing system, we're generally only losing 20 to 30% of that nitrogen as ammonia before it can be land applied. So it does a better job of capturing those manure nutrients and giving us some fertilizer value that we can really take advantage of. And I think that's a progression that we're seeing right now on the beef side. We tend to see a lot of farms moving away from open lot facilities and moving either towards bedded pack or towards that deep pit facility where their manure is more beneficial for their operation. So sometimes these things can drive positive change. And while no one likes to see fertilizer prices as astronomical as they were, looking at the past Iowa history, when we have seen these higher fertilizer prices, we've often seen farmers find reasons to do a better job of managing their manure. This is just a schematic that, as I think about the whole system approach to manure management and really what's happening, how I like to think about it. And there's losses that can occur at any point in the system. And really, one of our goals as livestock engineers or manure engineers is to think about how do we limit losses at each point along that process. It certainly is a complicated change, and making a management decision to improve one area without considering what it might mean downstream in our processing can really have unintended consequences. For example, in the early 2000s, Denmark passed a law that said you're going to put a cover on your manure storage. So they went out to their manure storages, put an impermeable cover on top, and that did a great job of limiting how much ammonia came off the manure while it was stored. That's a good thing. I think we can all agree to that. Unfortunately, they didn't do anything with the land application side. In Denmark, most of that manure is surface applied to grassland. So after they did a much better job of holding on to that ammonia in the storage, when it came time to land apply it, their ammonia volatilization losses went up. So while they thought they were having this big impact on ammonia, their actual resulting impact was much smaller than they originally anticipated because they just moved when and where a loss was occurring to somewhere later in the system. Okay, so when we think about nutrient management, it's really this balance of ins and outs. What am I bringing to my farm? What am I putting out? And how do I do that in ways that minimize some of the negatives? And those negatives include both the air emissions that I've mentioned, as well as losses to groundwater. Now, where the rubber meets the road on this, especially in Iowa, is how much manure should I be putting on any field, right, to meet my crop fertility demands and also to protect water quality? And this really occurs in two parts. There's a supply side, what's coming with my manure, and that has things to do with the concentration of the nitrogen or phosphorus in the manure. How available do I think those nutrients are? And that varies a lot by livestock species and manure handling system. And then what's my application method and loss that's going to occur at the time of application? And I think we can make some pretty reasonable estimates about that. And then there's a demand side, and that's really how much does my crop need? And that's sort of crop rotation and weather dependent, probably soil dependent as well. But it can get relatively complicated. And then we require farmers to do this for at least two nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. We really encourage them to think about potassium as well. But from a water quality protection standpoint, thinking about that nitrogen and phosphorus is really the most important. So when I think about the nutrient supply side, one of the challenges that we have with manure relative to some of those other fertilizer choices is that nitrogen comes in two forms, both organic and inorganic. Those organic nitrogen molecules are attached to some form of carbon, and because of how plants work, they can't utilize them right away. So one of the things that we have to try and do is estimate how much of that organic nitrogen will become plant available throughout the growing season. And in some ways, that's a good thing for us, right? We see people right now trying to come up with coatings for urea or adding inhibitors to their nitrogen product to try and slow down mineralization, to try and hold it in a form where it will be stable for a period of time before the plant can take it up. And that's essentially what organic nutrients are, right? They're sort of protected from loss as long as we have erosion under control, and it can work to our benefit. The challenge is, though, what we really want in our cropping system is to match that nitrogen becoming available with when the crop needs it. And organic nitrogen is a little unpredictable. It's dependent on the weather. It's dependent on rainfall, of how quick it will become available to our plant. Because of that, it's sometimes nice to have some inorganic nitrogen as a starter fertilizer to really get it going. Additionally, we might see manures where we have really high bedding components. One that comes to my mind is bedded pack manure, and we'll do an example of this later. But when you think about that bedded pack manure, it comes with so much carbon that when we put that on the soil, oftentimes at first we'll actually see nitrogen immobilized as the bacteria work to break down all that carbon material we've added. They'll take nitrogen from the soil and they'll be less available to get plants started. So if we're using only bedded pack manure as our only fertility source to help support crop production, oftentimes in the spring we'll see yellow corn and be quite disappointed. And I know a few people have said, well, I'll just put more on to make up for that. And it's really a self-defeating process, right? If that fertilizer itself is what's causing immobilization, putting more on doesn't make up for it, right? It just slows down when that will become available and pushes it back later in the growing season. All right, so why am I actually talking about availability? And it's sort of this phenomena. When you look at Iowa State recommendations for nitrogen availability, it's mostly based on species. So if I look at liquid swine manure, whether it be in an anaerobic lagoon or a deep pit, we're going to say that 90 to 100% of that nitrogen is available the first year. And that makes a lot of sense. If you take a manure sample out of a deep pit, on average in this state, 80% of it is ammonical nitrogen while it's in the manure pit. That ammonical nitrogen is already in a plant available form, right? So it's not surprising to say, well, a very high percentage of that nitrogen must be plant available. Where I think it gets more interesting is when I look at some of those other species manure, whether it be cattle or poultry. If we look at that first year availability, we're roughly accounting for half of the nitrogen. And even if we add up second and third year availability, we might only be looking at something like 60, 70% of all the nitrogen that's there. That last 30% we're not accounting for. It's a slow release nitrogen where it takes a lot of time. It's sort of in that soil organic nitrogen pool. And does it mineralize? Certainly. Does it mineralize at a rate where if we don't put additional fertilizer on, we can detect it? Generally not in our yield trials, and that makes utilizing it much more challenging. And a little story about this, there is some poultry litter plots we've had west of Ames here for about 25 years now. And I think it's always interesting to see sort of the same management treatment on a plot for an extended period of time, because it gives us a chance to see how things change with time, but also to get a better understanding of what was really happening. And one of the things that we saw early on in that study is when we used manure versus commercial fertilizer applied at the same nitrogen application rate for the first 5 years, that commercial fertilizer always out yielded manure. Following that, the next 15 years of that study, manure at the same nitrogen application rate has out yielded that commercial fertilizer every year. And that's sort of interesting to think about. And I was really, pondering one day why that happened. And after 20 years, I think it's sometimes useful to review those studies. And one of the things we saw is greater nitrogen in the soil, greater soil organic nitrogen, greater soil organic matter content, improved aggregate stability. So it was really a good indicator that manure had improved some of the soil health characteristics. But to me, it also showed that by increasing that soil organic nitrogen content, we had increased the amount of nitrogen cycling in any given year. But our recommendations from Iowa State, it's hard to say how much of that nitrogen do we get back in any given year? And that makes it hard to tailor our manure recommendations. So the truth is, while we were saying that we're applying 100% of our nitrogen needs with that manure, because we had put manure on so long in that remaining 30%, and maybe we're only getting half to 1% back in any given year, we had done it long enough that it sort of added up, and we had this field that had a rich manure history, but didn't adjust our fertilizer recommendations because of it. So I think as we move forward, hopefully get some better understanding of soil health, that might be an area where we're ripe for improvement on getting better utilization of our nitrogen. The other challenge that we often have is we'll see this table, and if you utilize manure, there's a great Iowa State Extension document, PMR 1003, utilizing manure nutrients for crop production. It has this table directly in it, and it makes it sound relatively simple, right? I find what sort of equipment I'm using. I find this correction factor, which is really what percent of nitrogen do I get to take credit for. Whatever the remaining percent there is what I'm estimating to lose to volatilization, and we assume it's all the same. And I just have two pictures to illustrate this point on my slide. I was out at a field one day doing a site visit, and they were running injection equipment. So they're probably assuming that 99% of their nitrogen is there. And in one part of the field, right, this bottom center picture, it looks brilliant. You don't see any manure pooling to the surface. It's all interacting with that soil right away. We have really good coverage with soil, not just with crop residue, and I'm really happy. And then I went to another part of the field, and we see this, and it's these areas where we ran the same injection equipment, but that manure is still pooled there 10, 15 minutes after we've been there. And that's giving us an opportunity for nitrogen loss. You don't see much soil that got thrown on the top of that manure to help protect us there. And I think a lot of that causes, well, next spring, it'll probably cause some yellow corn in that area. We won't feel as good about how our manure provide nitrogen. And all of a sudden, we don't trust these recommendations as much. So one of the challenges really building confidence, building certainty in what's happening with manure. And we're in a digital age. We can collect information a lot more rapidly now. We get a lot more information, oftentimes at a row or plant level, and can see that spatial heterogeneity in the field. And I think those give us tools that are both helpful, right? Because I can tailor my management in different parts of the field to say, maybe this part should have been tilled to help with some of that compaction before I was doing my manure injection. But it also makes us see that sometimes that manure has much more variation than we thought, and hurts our confidence in using some of the assumptions that we've had before about how well it can supply nitrogen. I did just want to give an example so that we can see sort of how this process of calculating application rates work. And this is just a typical swine manure from a deep pit finisher here in Iowa. If you're using wet dry feeders, oftentimes we can see nitrogen concentrations as tested somewhere close to that 60 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons. It does depend on lots of factors, and the ration that we specifically use does matter, and how much water wastage and how we wash our barn plays a role in what that concentration will be as well. But hopefully we're up somewhere around 50, 60 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons. Based on the ISU publication, we should be assuming that the nitrogen in swine manure is between 90 and 100% available. Most of us are doing injection, right? So we're going to say that we're retaining 99% of that nitrogen, only volatilizing 1%. And if you sort of run that through these correction factors, you'll find that for every 1,000 gallons of manure, we're putting on 53 pounds of nitrogen, which is actually a pretty high amount historically. If you look back to the early thousands, we were probably much closer in that 20 to 30 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons of manure. And a lot of that is related to dietary changes, but an even greater fraction is due to changes in how we were managing manure. We've almost all went to deep pits, keeping that rainwater out. We've seen innovations on the livestock side to improve our feeders and waters so that we have less water wastage. And we've also seen farmers putting in greater effort to minimize water leaks in the barn, because that means more gallons that they have to haul out, and it's much tougher to make it a valuable fertilizer where it's more cost effective than utilizing commercial fertilizer if we're moving lots of water around. So that's been a nice change that has helped us all find more value in our manure. And I think high fertilizer prices often drive that innovation. When we see fertilizer prices go up, we, as the livestock farmers, have an opportunity to make changes to our operation and have them help us make more money and probably help the environment while we do. On the nutrient demand side, there's really two methods. There's this yield goal method, and if you look through Iowa manure management plans, that's the method that's supported in the plan. It walks you through that in a step-by-step process. And then ISU has utilized this crop response method, we'll call it maximum return to nitrogen generally, for its recommendation of how much nitrogen we should put on in any given year for a crop, at least on average. And I want to walk through a little bit of these methods. We won't go through them in detail, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately. But I do want to talk about some of the differences and why I think we see what we see, and really what that means as we move ahead. With the yield goal method, it really is how much crop do I think I'm going to make? So you have to pick a reasonable yield. This has been defined for us as the average of the last 5 years plus 10%, or the average for the last 5 years, right? And that's a realistic yield. And I think that's reasonably true. Corn yields tend to go up, so the 10% is helping to account for how the yield per year, or yield per acre, goes up roughly 1.8 bushels per year in Iowa. And if you utilize the average of the last 5 years, these two numbers are generally about the same, actually. But if you're using that one, it generally meant that we had 1 year that sort of was a disaster year, where we maybe had a drought or something that happened to our crop that really inhibited it from growing. And what you're going to do is pick that yield and multiply it by a nitrogen utilization factor. And for corn, that nitrogen utilization factor varies throughout the state, but for most of the state, it's 1.2 bushels of nitrogen, or 1.2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of corn we expect to produce. Okay, so with that said, when this method was first proposed back in the 90s, corn tended to have roughly 0.8 of a pound of nitrogen per bushel of corn. When you look at some of the newer genetics we see today, that number is much closer to 0.6. Yield goal hasn't been updated to account for that. I think at first the method probably worked reasonably well, although there are some assumptions that have to go in. But as things have changed, as genetics have changed, maybe some of the base assumptions that we made before aren't as strategic as they were back then. You do have to take a legume credit. That works reasonably well. For soybeans, it's generally 50 pounds per acre. You get to take credit for 1 pound per bushel of soybean up to 50. on average, we have more than 50 bushel an acre of soybean yield in this state. So generally people are taking 50. And if you had alfalfa before, it's a little bit more complicated. You have to make an assessment of how good the alfalfa stand was. So what percentage of the field was really alfalfa and where we are in that rotation. So it is a little bit more rule of thumb, trying to come up with some best practices, but there are opportunities to do that. The maximum return to nitrogen really relies on rate trials, and those have been conducted on ISU facilities. One of the things I'm excited to see is I know that ISU scientists have some great work coming up where they're going to try and do some of these rate trials on more farms, more counties, and it'll be exciting to see sort of how that changes. And I think give more faith in the method, seeing it done locally. But really what you do is you pick a price for what you think corn's going to be selling for, and pick a price for what you think you'd have to pay for nitrogen or how we're valuing nitrogen. And especially if we're using this for manure, we can say, well, maybe it was the cost of putting that nitrogen on, but it is replacing our fertilizer. It is replacing some of that fertilizer bill. So picking a price that's very similar to commercial fertilizer generally makes sense. You hit calculate after entering what part of Iowa you are in, and it spits out this beautiful graph that shows you this green line, the cost of nitrogen. It's a linear line, right? For every extra pound of nitrogen I need to put on per acre, that costs me a little bit more. So that line makes sense. It also spits out this bluish purple line. That's how much corn we think we'd yield times the price of corn. And then the most important line to us is this red line, which is really just the difference between the two. And what's interesting about that red line is it has a maximum point, right? And that's sort of what we'd say is the optimum fertilizer rate. Now, there is some uncertainty on that, and it's an average, not a specific year tool. But if I was going to guess, and I didn't know anything else about the year of how much nitrogen to put on, the average does make a lot of sense. You can see that it does shade a few areas around this and bracket it. That's within $1 profit. So depending on your comfort margin, you can tend to be a little bit higher, a little bit lower than that rate and make about the same amount of profit. And every field's a little bit different probably. So with some tailoring to experience, you maybe know this field I'm better off to pick a little higher on that side of that optimum rate. In this field, I'm a little bit lower. So just to finish up that example we had before with that swine manure, we just really need to get our rate now. And here, if we're using that maximum return to nitrogen tool, it said we wanted 134. For every 1,000, we're getting 53. So in this case, it says I should put on about 2,500 gallons of manure, so that's swine manure per acre, to meet my nitrogen need for the crop. Now, I promised some comparison of the two. So that's really what I wanted to talk about here. And I think that's where our first important take home comes from. What I've plotted is these blue dots represent utilizing the yield goal method to come up with nitrogen application demand for average fields in Iowa. So it's based on our average yearly yield. And orange is the same for continuous corn. And the first thing you'll notice is a pretty strong increase with time as we've moved ahead from 1980 to 2000 to 2020. And that's just related to improved corn yield per acre per year, right? If we are growing more corn, that estimate says that we should be putting on more nitrogen. Starting in the mid 2000s there, I did the same thing for MRTN corn and soybean. And that was roughly the time period when the MRTN tool was released. And it also was relatively easy for me to go back and trace some nitrogen fertilizer prices and corn prices, at least on average for those. If you look at that tool, those rates have been relatively constant during that time. There certainly has been some fluctuation. And if you would leave nitrogen rates perfectly constant, there's a small trend up in that nitrogen demand, but they've been relatively constant. And one thing that I think we see happening, because those yield goal methods are increasing every year, they're diverging from what that MRTN recommendation is, right? Because they're increasing so rapidly while that MRTN rate is almost constant. It says that yield goal maybe early on was a pretty good approximation of that MRTN rate, but not so much anymore. Another way to look at this that I have shown in that graph in the bottom right is doing some partial budgets for where does corn grain end up. And what my partial budget really is representing, and this is for a corn soybean rotation, is how much nitrogen I'm putting on relative to how much nitrogen is being removed in the corn. And the reason I have partial budgets old and new is that the USDA estimate used to be 0.8 of a pound of nitrogen per bushel of corn. Now it's much closer to 0.6, oftentimes a little bit under that. And I think if you start picking these application rates that maybe people have historically used in Iowa of trying to be somewhere between 150 and 200 pounds of nitrogen, we used to see with that old budget, we had to get up to roughly 150 before we were putting on more nitrogen than what we think we were moving with corn. When we get up to that 200-ish, we were maybe losing somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year, whether through leaching or denitrification or some form that I'm not accounting for in grain harvest. But with our new budget, right, where there's less nitrogen actually per bushel of corn, we're a lot looser in sort of that cycling. And I think when you review some of the data on how much nitrogen we lose through tile drains, it does vary a lot by year to year, right? Depending on the weather and how much water actually moves through the soil. But a nice average number is somewhere in that 20 to 40 pounds of nitrate per year in that tile drainage water for an acre of corn. And that aligns relatively well if we were thinking about it from that old budget. But when we have less nitrogen in our corn, it tends to be looser and there's probably more free nitrogen floating around in the soil, potentially available for loss. I won't do too many more examples for manure application. This will actually be my last one, but I did want to just take a look at a bedded pack facility so that you could sort of see what's happening and maybe one other concern while we do that. So just some assumptions there for you. I tell us how much nitrogen and phosphorus in the manure. We're going to try and apply at roughly 150 pounds per acre. And then we're going to think about what that means for phosphorus. And I'm not going to bore you all too much with it, but if we're doing end supply, right, maybe we're picking a first year availability of 35% for bedded pack manure. Maybe we're leaving it on the surface after we put it on for some period of time and have some volatilization loss. If I was really putting on nitrogen, I'm getting about 8 pounds of nitrogen for every ton of manure that I put on, right? So not a whole lot of available nitrogen coming along. And if I said I needed 150 pounds, it might say I need to put on almost 20 pounds per acre of manure. And that's quite a bit, because if you think about that on the phosphorus side, right, and I'm putting on that much manure, all of a sudden that means I put on 800 pounds of phosphorus this year, right? And if I compare that to what I'm removing in a 2-year rotation of corn and soybeans with pretty average yield, I'm removing roughly 100 pounds. So it looks to me like I put on 16 years of phosphorus need, right? And that's one of the reasons that Iowa has a phosphorus index tool to help tell us when that's unacceptable, right? When the risk of phosphorus loss is too high to do something like that. But also as we think about maybe the higher fertilizer price regime we're on, and I pulled this graph just the other day of some estimated fertilizer prices. It does come from Illinois, but hopefully their prices are pretty similar to ours. We do see really high prices for phosphorus and potassium yet. And if we're putting on at that nitrogen limited rate and not taking advantage of that phosphorus in our manure, it's a real missed opportunity for us to think about and value that manure as a resource. Just to put some numbers to typical manures for this, if I have a deep pit swine finishing manure, first on the left there, I have what I consider really historic fertilizer prices. On the right, I have some going rates for today, right? We can see that prices are up. Oftentimes, I thought of that as roughly $32 per 1,000 gallons of manure. Our application cost is probably $15 to $20 per 1,000 gallons of manure. So there was $12 worth of potential value there for us to capture, right, by either hauling further to a field that needs it or things like that. But when you look at where we're sitting at this spring and now this fall for that value, it's much closer to $90 of potential nutrient value per 1,000 gallons of manure. And that's a really big swing. Now, with that said, our application prices this fall, given that labor prices are up, given that fuel prices are up and equipment prices with them, probably is going to be a little higher than that 15 to 20, maybe 20 to 25. But that still means there's opportunity for us to capture value by getting that manure a little further away from our facility, trying to take advantage of all those nutrients. We have seen this happen before. It happened in 2008 and again in 2012 when we had really fertilizer prices. And one of the things that the manure industry had happened then was a lot of improvements in equipment, a lot more investment in infrastructure and equipment, and potentially some changes in how we managed our manure. I would anticipate if this higher fertilizer price regime sticks around for another year, we'll continue to see that investment and hopefully some real improvements on some of our manure utilization side. One of the bigger challenges, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, is application timing with manure. And I think it's easy to say things like, well, earlier probably means that we've turned some of that manure nitrogen into nitrate and it's prone for loss before our corn is really up and growing and can utilize it. But it's an area that I still think there's lots of opportunity for study, and it's one that we've done a fair amount of study over the last few years. This is from 4 years of data up at Nashua, Iowa, where we had 4 treatments. EFM, early fall manure. That's roughly the beginning of October after we get the preceding soybean crop out. Early fall manure with a cover crop. You don't see too much yield difference there. It yielded about the same when we were early. It did have a little more yield variability. That first year we had less yield. The next 3 years we out yielded our control without cover crops. So potentially seeing some return of that residual nitrogen, helping boost some of that yield. Late fall manure, where we put it on roughly near the beginning of November. It did vary a little bit with the weather, but we saw a pretty nice yield hike from being able to delay that swine manure application a month of roughly 40 bushels per acre. So that adds up pretty quickly. And then it's not a manure comparison, but a spring UAN fertilizer where we saw another jump of about 30 bushels per acre from moving to fall to spring. It's not included in this data, but we have a similar study going on up there right now with fall and spring manure. And this first year, we saw roughly the same amount of corn growth, our corn yield in both the spring and the fall manure. And that makes sense. Last year at Nashua was really dry. We didn't see much tile drainage at all. It was roughly an inch, so we didn't have much nitrogen loss, and it made timing a little less significant. But that is something that we're going to continue to look at and see how moving from fall to spring makes an impact on corn yield. And presumably something much more similar to that UAN treatment over time will emerge by moving from fall. Even when we think it's well timed to spring, we'll probably have less nitrogen out there for potential loss. I did want to point out a few of the water quality contamination concentrations, that nitrate concentrations in the tile drainage at those sites. Adding rye to our system, especially with early fall manure, did a great job of capturing that nitrate that was moving down to the tile line. We saw roughly a 50% reduction from having that rye compared to not having that rye. When we look at season, we saw about a 25% reduction just by going from early fall manure to late fall manure. So from moving from a time where we know it's a little early to what we think of more optimum timing, we did see less of that nitrogen making it to tile lines. And that makes sense, right? We saw a greater yield. So we're converting more of that nitrogen into corn yield, at least it would look like. And that spring UAN did have a significantly lower nitrate level in the concentration. That spring UAN is actually side dressed onto those plots, so it is very well timed. And there is a tillage difference between that spring and the UAN and the manure. But hopefully it continues to show that by improving timing, we can get a lot better nitrogen capture. And I think those yield differences are quite striking, right? 40 bushels from going from early fall to late fall, another 30 bushels by going from fall to spring potentially. And I wanted to look at that just one more way here real quick. And that is, if you take that maximum return to nitrogen, it plots out a yield curve for you. And that blue line is essentially that yield curve. Now, I put all my nitrogen on at a rate of 150 pounds of nitrogen available in the spring. But if you think about how much corn I was able to generate from that late fall manure, essentially because of timing issues, it looks like I only took advantage of 75 pounds of that nitrogen application, as I was only able to get to roughly 87 to 90% of that nitrogen yield that I would have achieved, presumably, if it would have been a spring manure. And early fall manure is even lower, right? We're only having something like approximately 30, 40 pounds of nitrogen that we're effectively using. And I think that's really striking. When you think about nitrogen prices right now, they're about 70 cents, but they did get close to $1. When you think about valuing that nitrogen and what that means for us in the world of manure, well, timing really is a big deal, especially with some of these manures that have high ammonium concentrations to start with and potentially are more prone to loss when we have some of that earlier season manure. I did just want to highlight some of the newer work. Since we saw such great success with some of our cover crops, we're trying to continue to play around with some of those systems. These are in continuous corn systems. So we have our control, it's continuous corn. There is tillage on it, 1 year of data. So bear in mind that these aren't all knowing, all being, right? It was a dry year, but we did have 228 bushels of corn with that. We did 2 treatments where we interseeded cover crop at roughly V4, V5. And you can see a picture of that in that upper right-hand picture for the 30-inch rows of one cover crop row growing between that row of corn. we had pretty good yield there. Our biomass didn't really take off until we harvested that corn later in the fall. And then on the bottom picture, we tried to do the same thing. We twin rowed and had 60 inches roughly between those corn rows, a lot more cover crop. So if you are someone who has cattle and is interested in utilizing some of that cover crop as a forage, we did put a fair amount of cover crop down on the ground. It looked real pretty. Unfortunately, that first year we suffered a pretty big yield hit, and I'm interested to see if we've sort of got that tuned out this year, if it was weather dependent. I am learning as we're going. And then one other system that's relatively unique is we have something we're calling perennial ground cover. And really what it is Kentucky bluegrass. And you can see it in that middle picture. It looks quite pretty there, growing between the corn rows. We do spray that with Liberty. It will turn brown throughout most of the summer. It's green in that picture right there because it was our first year and we didn't want to knock it back, but it looked pretty good and it yielded relatively similar. So I'm excited to see where that takes us as we move forward. Just one last thing I wanted to touch on, and I've pushed at timing a lot today, and I think I push at timing because, well, we have some data that says timing is really important for both water quality, for yield, and I think one of the reasons that we continue to see Iowa farmers really picking that yield goal method for how much nitrogen they need to put on with manure is when they've went to MRTN, they feel like they're short on nitrogen, and a part of that is we've lost some of that nitrogen before we've got our corn up and growing, right? So that timing is a really critical aspect. And as we think about why aren't farmers just using this maximum return to nitrogen rate that we've been talking about for the last 10, 15 years, a big part of it is when they've tried it, they've seen less yield than when they utilize the yield goal. And I don't think that inherently means the method is wrong. I think it's more related to that timing, which means as a manure scientist, I have to try and find ways to help them improve timing. And while my pictures here don't immediately show what that means, one thing that I think could help us do this is some of these emerging carbon markets. And we've heard a lot of talk about emerging carbon markets, especially related to anaerobic digestion, which you can see sort of in those bottom two pictures on the right, and how that might work for methane capture and recovery. And certainly there's a beautiful carbon market there. But just as exciting for me is maybe there can be some carbon credits for applying our manure both spring throughout the growing season in the summer and the fall. And while you don't qualify for some of those really beautiful carbon credits from renewable fuel production where you might get $150 per ton of CO2 not emitted, there's an offset market that we could potentially qualify that pays roughly $30 a ton of CO2. And if you would think about this, a typical Iowa swine farm releases somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 18 kilograms of methane per pig space per year. And if you multiply that by 25, you can get kilograms of CO2. And if you turn that into how much money could we make on this offset market with a 70% reduction, which I think applying manure spring, summer, and fall could generate for us, we can start talking about $10 a pig space of potential carbon credit profit that we're generating. Now, our current equipment probably won't be able to apply into standing corn, right? It certainly wasn't designed for that. But we do have some equipment where people have developed to side dress manure onto standing corn. You can see one version of that in the upper picture. Another one that we're working with starting next year is this Rain 360 on the bottom. And it really can extend some of that application season. And if you start thinking about what that means on a 5,000 head pig farm, if I'm getting $10 a pig space, I have a typo here, rather than being 5,000 a year, I could generate potentially $50,000 a year in carbon credit revenue to help pay for this piece of equipment. And especially with something like the Rain 360, where that piece of equipment is probably in the $200,000 to $250,000 range. I will need to buy a few other things, pumps, hoses, to get that manure there. All of a sudden, we're starting to say, well, that might support us to really help buy that equipment. We don't need better yield. We don't need improvements in nitrogen loss, both of which I think we could get. But those carbon credits alone might be enough to help incentivize some of that being installed and utilized. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity for us, especially when I look at some of the work and data that I've seen and have on nitrogen application timing and the role it plays. So with that, there's some contact information for me if you want to be in touch. I'd be happy to try and address any questions you might have. And if you are looking to be a certified crop advisor and get your continuing education credits, you can see the information now on the slide.
All right, perfect. And so we already have a couple of questions in the chat, and if you have more, keep sending them. The first question is, how are you seeing anaerobic digesters change the way some producers are dealing with manure?
Okay, that's a great question and a few things. We have seen quite a few digesters get implemented here in Iowa recently. Historically, we were running roughly 3 to 4 anaerobic digesters on livestock farms. Within the last year, we've seen 8 installed already. I anticipate that we'll probably see that installed again. As I mentioned, the carbon credit market is quite lucrative, especially for dairy farms. Not quite as much for deep pit farms, but I think people are working on trying to develop those systems. So a few things. When you think about anaerobic digesters, they're actually net nutrient neutral. The amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that goes into the digester should come out on the back end. So it won't change how much manure we have. It won't change how much land we need to utilize that manure as a fertilizer resource. But in some cases, it can change the manure characteristics. And with swine manure, I don't see that happening so much. It might help us. It probably will help us with some of the pathogens and antibiotic resistance that we see in manure and make that less of a risk. But when we have something like a cattle facility where we typically would estimate 30 to 50% of that nitrogen available in the first year, by processing that manure through an anaerobic digester, much of that organic nitrogen will be converted into ammonia. So typically, for a dairy digester, I would anticipate that something like 70% of the nitrogen that went into the digester will come out as ammonia. And that really means 70% of that nitrogen at least should be available that first year application. So one thing that I think we'll have to do and pay attention to is how are we picking our nitrogen availability on those sites, and are we adjusting accordingly for running through an anaerobic digester? The other thing I want to point out is I mentioned that Denmark example where they started covering their storage and then not injecting, and they thought they'd see lots of improvement, and they ended up seeing a little improvement, but really more ammonia volatilization at the time of land application. One thing that can happen at some of these anaerobic digestion facilities is while it sits in that anaerobic digester for roughly 30 to 35 days, when it comes out, it has to go to a storage. And typically, dairy manure has formed a crust on top. That crust works to our advantage to holding on to ammonia in the manure. After we've ran through an anaerobic digester, especially if we're doing solid separation along with that anaerobic digester, that manure might be sitting there without forming a crust, and that makes it more prone to ammonia volatilization. So I think as we see digesters, and they can be a great thing, right? They can be economically friendly to farms right now. They can help reduce some of our greenhouse gas emissions. But we do have to think carefully about how we're utilizing them and what that means in our manure process so that we're not volatilizing more of that nitrogen and changing this greenhouse gas emission issue for something that becomes a nitrogen emission issue from some of these farms. But really, digesters should be net nitrogen neutral. Any nitrogen we put on the front end should come out of the back end, and we'll still need the same amount of land. So they aren't going to change our manure situation in Iowa.
All right. Another question is you mentioned being in a digital age. What type of research could you do if Iowa digitized manure management plans?
Well, a few things. But in a digital age, I think one thing that we really see now already is people are doing a really nice job of utilizing flow meters on most of their manure application equipment that's liquid load cells on there. Right now, I have a project with John Deere looking at their real-time nutrient sensing system so that hopefully we could make adjustments on the fly based on nitrogen concentrations in the manure. If we get a slug of manure that's higher in nitrogen for some reason, it will pick that up and we can adjust our application rate in terms of gallons per acre down accordingly. One thing that I think would be interesting from a standpoint where if manure management plans were digitized and made more available, right now I'm giving you county level estimates about how much land is available being utilized for manure application. If those records were digitized, we could see fields that were getting manure. And there are some definitely data issues that we'd have to think about and work around from that. And my attempt at that right now is I'll often draw circles around livestock production facilities and really get a hang of it. But I think if the data was digitized, it'd be a great database for soil samples, right? What sort of concentrations of phosphorus do we see in fields that are typically getting manure? Right now, I do get some farmers to share their manure management plans with me. I can see where their phosphorus is. But if I had that at a much larger level, we could really start to think strategically about how do we help some of these farms get manure where that phosphorus is needed and make sure it's not just going on fields that are already testing high in phosphorus. And I think there's great opportunities along those lines. It would also help us potentially identify watersheds at a smaller level where we could see typical application rates, at least what they're being pointed at and start doing some paired watershed work that's a little easier to conduct. Now, if I do paired watershed work, I can go request manure management plans. They are a little bit of work to dig through to see at a DNR extension office and to try and make some sense of them. But I think that data is there, but it would be a lot easier to sort of work with it and not have to do so much pre-processing. And oftentimes when I have to do the pre-processing, I find a nice undergraduate student to help me out with that and pay them accordingly for their time and effort.
All right, another question. Is all manure created equally? Are there site differences or any other meaningful differences?
That's a great question and a tough one at the same time. There are differences, right? So all manure is not created equal. It really depends on the ration that we're feeding the animal, the type of animal, our manure management system, how good we are at upkeep of different components of it. So every manure will test a little bit different. That's why it's important to get a sample of that manure. But even when you think about sort of how does pig manure compare to cattle manure, compare to poultry manure? They all have some advantages and disadvantages. And one thing I often say is manure is a complete fertilizer. It has that nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, many micronutrients for us, but it isn't always a balanced fertilizer, right? And I think one of the challenges that we often see is how do we use manure strategically so that we can take advantage of all those nitrogen, all those nutrient resources. For example, pig diets have changed quite a bit over the last 15 to 20 years. We see pig diets including a lot more phytase, often including a lot more distillers grains. And one of the things that's done is increase the nitrogen concentration in the manure relative to the phosphorus concentration. So when I was still a student, one of the things that people talked about a lot is how do we develop solid liquid separation systems? How do we improve phosphorus separation of the swine manure so that we can better balance that manure resource to what our crop needs. And our change in feeding practice has really gotten us close to a phosphorus balance for nitrogen to phosphorus ratios if we're in a corn soybean rotation. So while that's still an issue, it's less pressing than maybe it used to be. With that said, with manures like poultry manure, we'll often see high phosphorus relative to nitrogen, just like I showed you for that bedded pack manure, where if we're putting out at a nitrogen rate, we might have enough phosphorus to supplied for 4, 5, 6, maybe even 8 years of a rotation. And that in itself isn't inherently bad, right? If I take a beef cattle manure, put it on a field, and I've supplied 8 years of phosphorus, if I don't come back and put manure on for another 8 years, I feel okay about that. But I think a better strategic management is maybe putting on 4 years worth of phosphorus, taking credit for that nitrogen, supplementing it with the commercial available nitrogen products in the meantime, and then coming back to that field in 4 years. But because of that, I think manure inherently isn't equal, right? All of these different manures have some of these intricacies that we want to think about. The same if you really want to sell manure as a fertilizer product. I think we see this working relatively well with some of our poultry litters, where once it's loaded on a truck, it can be relatively cost effective to haul it distances of 20, 25 miles. With liquid manures, it's just hauling too much water around. It needs to be utilized relatively closely. And while we can move liquid manures, I think oftentimes, especially with commercial fertilizer prices where they are right now, we might be able to economically move manure 4 to 5 miles for liquid swine manure. It really isn't something where we're going to see it exported out of county, so it probably pays to have some semblance of balance between crop land available and how much manure is being generated in that area. Whereas solid manures help us get around some of that because we really can afford to move it around a little more.
All right, another question is why does the Iowa DNR still use 1.1 to 1.2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of yield goal in manure application planning regulations?
Well, I think that's an area that they could revisit and look at. I think it's written into code right now, which means changes on it take some time and are a little bit slower to happen. But it is an area I think that it's important that probably soon gets reviewed and thought about a little bit more closely. I do think that the Iowa State project, where they're doing some of those maximum return to nitrogen type trials at many different counties in Iowa, would help strengthen that recommendation about where we should end up at. The other thing to at least think about as we have that discussion is the yield goal method is really calculating the maximum allowable rate that we could put on. It's not saying this is optimum. It's not even saying it's the recommended rate. It's just the maximum allowable rate. So when you come up with something that's maximum allowable, it sort of gets regulatory and complex because it's not always strictly based on science. It's based on science ideas and how to best interpret them to where is a cutoff threshold, right? And if you look at nitrogen application rates, there isn't a threshold where I was putting on 150 pounds of nitrogen an acre, I'm good. I went up to 160 and all of a sudden I'm not good, right? There's a lot of gray area in between. And anytime that we want to try and change a policy like that, I think it's important for us to understand sort of that implication and what's happening. But I do think, and you heard me talk about it quite a bit today, if we take that historic data that said there was 0.8 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of corn, and now say all the newer data seems to indicate 0.6, that does mean that maybe we should start thinking about adjusting the yield goal method to change that. Or potentially, since it's not an ISU recommended application method anymore, maybe we should be looking at MRTN. And I think DNR does have those discussions. I think they're still trying to figure out the best path forward and have a solution that works for as many both farmers and the public as possible, because I think it is an important decision, and it could be a tough decision if you were told today that you have enough land to land apply all your manure and think of it as a resource for your farm, and all of a sudden tomorrow you have to start thinking about, I don't have enough land, and how do I start marketing it? So I think those changes do get looked at. I think hopefully we'll continue to look at them very closely, but it is something that we have to be very thoughtful about how we're doing.
All right, and last question here. It's a two-parter. Have you compared the fertilizer value or efficiency of an integrated system of grazing cattle on cover crops following a crop harvest? Part one.
Yeah, I have not, although we could make some estimates of it. I think in general, for my idea of a grazing system is most of the time they're roughly in balance, right? And certainly if we can graze our cover crop or harvest our cover crop, that does give us a lot of advantage in both feeding our livestock, right? And recycling some of those nutrients directly where we don't have to do as much work. So I think there are some great opportunities there. And just off what you saw, certainly when we have less nitrogen loss to tile line, it looks like that should be, cover crops alone should be improving our nitrogen utilization efficiency. But we didn't necessarily see that in corn yield in that study. Now, it could be we just didn't go along long enough, right? I did say that the first year we saw a sizable yield reduction when we use cover crop, and then the next 3 years we saw improved yield with cover crop. We continue to do that yield trial up there. This last year we actually saw reduced yield with cover crop, relatively slightly, but still reduced. But it does at least have the potential, right? That nitrogen has to be somewhere. Trying to understand where it's going could help us improve our nitrogen utilization efficiency. But having cattle graze the cover crop just by itself, that already has added improvement in our nitrogen utilization efficiency on that acre.
All right, and last part, does an integrated livestock and crop system provide a more diversified income stream for producers, meaning protecting farmers from wide swings in incomes, because we know that generally when crops are bringing high prices, livestock prices are lower and vice versa?
Yes, I think that's a relatively easy answer to say. I think when I grew up, people often said the best way to sell corn is to walk it off on 4 feet, right? I think when you look at sort of what livestock production is, it's a bioprocessing facility, and we've seen ethanol facilities get built in Iowa to sort of add to that, right? They're bioprocessing, they're adding value to corn by turning it into some other things, DDGs and ethanol. And livestock facilities are really doing the same thing, right? We're upgrading corn to more valuable types of protein. So there is some advantages to it. It also can be more work and more challenging to integrate. But oftentimes, especially when you look at sort of where livestock historically has been placed around the US, it's often been in land that hasn't been maybe as high value for cropland, right? Wisconsin's a dairy state because they have some land that it was impossible to grow corn on, right? You had to grow other things, alfalfa, hays. And a lot of that had to do with making sure that if you did have this type of land, or if you would have a crop value, there's still ways to find value to it. So livestock is a great potential use mechanism for that. And actually from a nitrogen utilization standpoint, a phosphorus utilization standpoint, trying to integrate those cropping facilities and livestock facilities together is extremely important. And while it's often nice to say that they're together on the same farm, I think that gives, from a manure planning standpoint, some ease and certainty. It doesn't have to be necessarily the same operation. In some cases, marketing your manure to local crop farmers while you are focused on the livestock production side can be a good thing, right? It's the actual making sure that we're recycling those nutrients that really matters. Now, the struggle with that is both sides have to work to an agreement. It can be challenging to work through some of those logistics. How do you price manure, both with the positive benefits it provides, as well as some of the potential drawbacks, like I don't always have great control over timing of application because the weather doesn't always cooperate.
All right, and if you could advance to the last slide for me.
Oop.
Yes, so next week, Making Space for Wildlife on Working Farms with Jorgen Rose from Practical Farmers of Iowa will be presenting here next week at the same time, noon on Wednesday. Thank you all for joining, and thank you for your questions, and have a great rest of your day.